One of the most important changes and shifts that we've seen in the last few years with CSS and XHTML is that as we get away from the presentational markup that we've talked about quite often in this tutorial, we begin to understand that we need to name things more appropriately for meaning as opposed to presentation. And you saw how that works in XHTML, but it has a corollary in CSS that's important to discuss. When it comes to the naming of classes and unique identifiers, IDs, it's important that we name those things which are custom. We have the total authority over how we name those to name not in relation to the way that it looks, but what it means, which is exactly what we were talking about in relation to XHTML.
It's a common trap that people new to CSS will fall into.
Absolutely. And, it's really funny because the first example I have here under presentational naming, I stuck in after Andy had, done this very nice, sophisticated stuff. Because back in the day when I was working at MSN in IE 3.0, which was the first commercial browser to have CSS support to the extent that it did, we used to do things like this. We used to create classes and describe them by what we were creating visually, not what we were creating in terms of meaning. So something like 12-point times red was a very common thing to see at Microsoft back in those days. And it was, it makes me laugh at how far we've come and how I used to do things. And, it's like, what were we thinking?
I should confess that when I started working with Dreamweaver 4, which had some reasonable CSS support for text styling at that time, my documents were full of 20 or 30 paragraphs, each one which had a class of class equals black text.
Yeah, exactly. This is the same kind of thing. So as you can tell, if you have class equals 12-point times red or class equals black text, you're talking about what it looks like, not what it means. So in this case, we're really trying to get away from presentational naming. And we've got some examples here like div container, header, wrapper, right, left, and footer. Now, there are granular arguments. One could say, okay, header, footer, these are very commonly used areas. They are maybe presentational, but they're known factors, and there's no reason really to get that, religious about it. But when we talk about things like right and left, it becomes very clear as to why presentational naming becomes a problem. Many of the people that I work with are very large institutions, government institutions that are managing massive amounts of documents, millions of documents, and some of you might be doing the same as well. Well, what happens when you create a division that is given an ID of right, okay, and then the administrator comes along and says, hey, something's come down from the main office. They really want that particular right-hand column to appear on the left. Well, you as the CSS designer can go into your CSS file and change that by simply, overwriting it and changing it to left, and then you save your file. And guess what? You're going to automatically switch that particular column from the right to the left. But the problem is now in a million documents, you have ID equals right, when in fact that particular division is on the left, completely confusing everybody that's trying to work on this particular site. So you run into real problems when you have this sort of presentational naming. And so it's very, very wise to begin to name things, as we have been encouraging you throughout this tutorial, thinking about things in terms of the semantic meaning, what this means. So instead of 12-point times red, I might have a class of error, because that is what it means, that I am trying to signify that if they see something in that particular font and font size, which, by the way, of course, we wouldn't be using points for the screen nowadays, something we also used to do back then that was pretty sloppy, but that this particular class was used to describe something that was revealing itself to be an error. And as we see here, there's some comparisons that Andy has set up. Container, branding. He likes to use things like content underscore main, content sub to divide up his documents in ways that make meaningful sense to what's going on. When we say div container or div branding, especially, okay, we know that that's the branding area.
It may well be, instead of calling it header, it may well be that one day we need to put that header down the bottom or down the left or down the right-hand side.
Right. Same kind of thing as right or left, which is why header and footer are fundamentally presentational. But again, there are some gray areas there. And, the best thing to do is really to think about, what is this that I'm describing? What am I trying to describe? Well, if it's content, great. And if it's a main content area, well, why not call it content main? If it's a sub-content area, why not call it content sub, as opposed to something like paragraph or with red text or whatever it is, that you're trying to do. So not describing it with those presentational names. And here we have like nav main, you could have nav sub. And as you can see, these are really naming conventions, site info, that are based on the meaning and also function. Now, there's an interesting argument that gets even more granular, that function changes too, that this site info might become something else other than site info at some time. So there's an even deeper argument there to think about, because maybe we need to even be refining what we think are non-presentational names and becoming more and more semantic.
What's interesting is that there are no real conventions, widespread conventions that cross organisations. So, for example, in large organisations or some large companies, they might already have set some convention for this type of reason. But across the web in general, when it comes to naming these areas of content, there's no standard conventions that have yet been established. And yet we're starting to see these evolve now, almost organically, through different initiatives such as micro formats.
I wouldn't say it's almost organically. I would say it's very much organically. When you open up CSS now, if you just visit somebody's site and you open up their CSS, you're going to see content, div content. You're going to see that everywhere. I mean, it has become, that's probably one of the most ubiquitous and familiar of conventions that have emerged. You could call that anything you want it to, but it's really nice, I think, to come up with some conventions. Andy's been doing work on gathering that information, and other people have worked on that as well, and I think we're going to see some good things emerge from that. Because think about moving from a job to another job, and you're working as a web designer. If content is always content, that makes your job so much easier. You know exactly what on the page you're dealing with.
And it also makes it much easier for different members of a team to be working on the same site or the same document.
Absolutely. And this is where I think these types of workflow issues and best practices really pan out when you look at the real world working environment, especially in team-based, and the larger the team, the more the necessity for some consistency.
The interesting thing is that there's not one right way of doing it. I think it's important to find a convention and stick to it. And, even if you're just a one-person designer, when you open up a project that you might have done kind of 5 or 6 months ago or perhaps earlier, you spend, it's often the case that you spend 5 minutes scratching your head thinking, what does this relate to?
What is this?
What is this?
Yeah, you really have to go through a deconstruction process before you can get to the answer.
So I think it's very, very important that we look to working with conventions.
Definitely. And not only are conventions important for naming, but they are important also for how we manage our CSS files, which we're going to take a look at in the next exercise.